Mr. Wold, given sort of the role that you played in trying to provide more transparency of what happened during the 4 years under Joe Biden, who was running the country under Joe Biden? Let's just take the last 2 years.
It's a great question, Senator, and at some level, I'm not the right witness for this hearing. I mean, there should be members of the media here, maybe some of your Senate colleagues who had known the president over the years and obviously had close proximity during the time of his administration, and obviously his staff. I think, sort of align with your previous question, there is a real consideration here on authentication. And in my time in the first Trump White House, there was an exhaustive process to determine how paper flowed into the Oval and when the president had given his assent to a certain action. That was through, in fact, 2 different policy channels, the staff secretary, and then there was also an office, essentially of policy management, guiding the flow of documentation. If the Biden administration staffers and personnel wanted to put this to bed, they could very easily dispel all of this by saying, here are the documents that show the president assented to these actions. The Trump administration would have that. Previous administrations would have that. And if that's not there, then there is cause to improve the way that executive branch employees authenticate actions undertaken by the president.
Yeah, I mean, the president actually performing the functions of president is kind of an important thing in our constitutional order. You had, kings used to affix their seal to show that this was an official declaration from the sovereign in this country. The sovereign are the people. They delegate, the authority to their elected representatives. And as you mentioned in your opening statement, there's only one person elected by everybody. So that signature, this is not just a small point, that signature issuing a pardon for someone who'd been convicted of a crime, or in the case of Joe Biden, these preemptive pardons, which are sort of unprecedented, is a big deal. And I think that's part of the reason why we're here today. Mr. Spicer, I wanted to ask you, you alluded to this, but the media, so desperate to make sure President Trump never got back into office. Of course, you saw the lawfare that took place, but then, of course, this narrative that Joe Biden was fine, don't believe your lying eyes, until that they couldn't deny it anymore based on the debate. Could you just kind of compare that to your experience when you were, press secretary for President Trump, to sort of the inquiries that were made daily about his mental acuity versus the inability to do that during the 4 years under Joe Biden?
Senator, in many cases, there was no inquiry. They would just run with a story, having guests on that would question his physical or mental acuity, speculate on it, bring guests on that would speculate it. We would often then push back on those kind of stories. That's in vast contrast to the lack of any kind of curiosity that existed throughout the 4 years of President Biden. And I think the difference was they would seize on the simplest thing with President Trump, whereas in President Biden's case, there was multiple issues of physical, mental confusion, him going in the wrong direction, him falling down, him misunderstanding an event or not being able to finish the sentence. That was never the case with President Trump. They were almost manufacturing instances in his case without actually trying to get to the bottom of a story or inquire within the press office to get our response. They would go with the story, then we'd push back. With Biden, my understanding from the conversations that I would have with the media is they would never ask. They just literally were basically afraid to go there.
Senator Cornyn.
Professor Harrison, it strikes me when talking about the autopen, there are really 2 issues. One is the mechanical use of an autopen in lieu of an actual signature by the president. But it seems to me that we're confronted with more important or more fundamental issues is, did the president know that the autopen was being used for that purpose? And so one would be if somebody stole the autopen and was signing pardons on behalf of the president, but what we're confronted with here is really the capacity of the president of the United States to understand what he was supposed to be doing. And just thinking about other areas of the law where capacity is important, and whenever it comes to people writing a will, let's say, for example, disposing of their property to their children and grandchildren, occasionally there arises the issue of testamentary capacity by the person disposing of their property. And generally speaking, to have testamentary capacity, that person must understand they're signing a will, they comprehend the nature and the extent of their property, they recognize their relationships with potential beneficiaries, and understand how the will disposes of their assets. So why can't we have a similar inquiry into the executive capacity, let's say, of the President of the United States to actually know what he or she is doing?
Senator, you're absolutely right that question, whether the president or somebody else who holds official power has the legal capacity to exercise it, is distinct from authentication of documents. Authentication of documents is important, but capacity is another question. With respect specifically to the president, I think the answer there is, and this may be out of the frying pan into the fire kind of answer. The answer there is Article 2 and then the 25th Amendment deal with the situation in which the president is unable to exercise his powers and duties. And I think it's a reasonable inference, although the Constitution doesn't come out and say this, that a president who is not determined to be unable through now what's the 25th Amendment process for making that determination. There's no process in Article 2 itself. The 25th Amendment added something. A president who has not been, pursuant to the 25th Amendment, determined not to be able to exercise the powers and duties of the president is presumed to have capacity to do that. I say that not on the basis of any sort of, other than practice, that's the way it's been for a couple of hundred years, but I think that is a reasonable inference from the fact that the Constitution does make a provision about what happens when the president's unable, and the 25th Amendment then provides a process to determine by which the president's unable.
Mr. Wold, following up on Professor Harrison's answer, the 25th Amendment requires actions by the Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet to declare the President incapacitated, incapable of carrying out his or her duties. But there doesn't appear to be any accountability or any remedy when they fail to act as they did in this case. Some have suggested that there may be potential crimes committed by members of the Cabinet for failing to act, basically suborning perjury, forging government documents, impersonating a federal officer, making false statements, conspiracy to defraud the United States, obstruction of justice, wire or mail fraud. Those are all statutes, criminal statutes that are on the books. Do you think there's any application of any of those criminal statutes to the circumstances of the Biden presidency and his incapacity and the failure of those persons, only persons authorized to question that incapacity under the 25th Amendment, the failure on their part to act?
Senator, there very well could be. I mean, obviously that would be a question for a prosecutor to take up in their discretion. I will say the 25th Amendment, it's a modern contrivance, but it still is consistent with American constitutional tradition, which it assumes that officers of the United States will act virtuously and morally. And the idea that members of the cabinet would go to the length of avoiding the Oval Office so as to abdicate their responsibility to verify the appropriateness of the president's acuity or the ability to authenticate actions taken by the president. If that's not a constitutional scandal, I mean, honestly, I don't know what would constitute such. So yeah, I mean, I think there could be the potential for crimes, but moreover, the 25th Amendment can only function in its procedural mechanisms if people are actually willing to call a spade a spade.